Hello, everybody. Welcome back to This Weird House. I am, as always, Nick Boddick, and today we have a very special guest, someone who is near and dear to me in a roundabout way, even though I have only spoken to him a few times. He is the author of the books that have the best titles in all of horror. He is Mr. John Langan. How are you today, John?
Good morning. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Nick, and thanks for such a that's high praise indeed. There's a lot of great titles out there.
There are, but I mean, and I'm not alone in saying this. Is that I mean, you start like Mr. Gaunt inspires curiosity, but then you get into like the wide carnivorous sky. I mean, and then Corpsemouth was just. As soon as I saw that, I was like, I already knew I was gonna get the book, but I was like, I need it, I need it. And yeah, like the wide carnivorous sky, corpse mouth, children of the fang. That was the first one actually that I read of yours was Children of the Fang,
Hmm.
and I picked it up on title alone because I was when I was a green horror. I wrote a lot of horror before I started reading a lot of horror,
Sure.
and that one, Children of the Fang, drew me in on that one.
Well, that's good to
Um,
know. That's good. I'll pass that back to the market research people.
for sure. So I start when I'm speaking to authors. I generally start with the same question, which I will start with today: is what was your introduction to the horror genre? Just was it movies, books, TV, and what about horror drew you in?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm in the process actually of trying to write an essay on that very subject.
Oh,
I've been invited to contribute to a collection of essays on the topic why I love horror, and I've been
oh,
thinking about that because I have written about that before in the story notes to those collections, in different written interviews and yeah, and in person interviews too, and so I've been trying to think about that and also not repeat myself too much. The I think in terms of media, the first media through which I encountered horror was film. And it was a version of Frankenstein that I have never been able to locate since I saw it, which means I'm probably not remembering it correctly.
you're
But
right.
to the best of my recall, my father was watching a version of Frankenstein, an adaptation of Frankenstein, in my parents' room, which had like the big TV in it, and my mother wanted nothing to do with that. So she was sitting out in the kitchen with, in my memory, with my younger brother and the older my younger sisters. My youngest sister, I guess, hadn't been born yet, and they were making. They were doing some kind of craft thing, like they were making these little popsicle stick men. And my father, in the meantime, had said, "Well, I'm watching this movie," and he said to me, "You can come in and watch it if you want." Um, and so I would go in and I would watch a little bit of this movie, and in my memory, the screen has this kind of red cast, as if it was like some kind of poor quality print or something, or maybe it was our TV. I don't know. And there's a scene with the monster who's wearing a like a fur sort of vest and what look like jeans and sneakers, and he's chained to a rock. And somebody, and I guess it's Dr. Frankenstein, is trying to talk to him. And I think there were other things. I might, because then I ducked out. I was like, nope, nope, that's too much. But then I went back in again, and then I ducked out, and then I went back in again. Um, and that left me with this lifelong. That was the beginning, left me with this lifelong fear of the Frankenstein's monster. I have watched, many movies since then and such, and read Shelley's original and taught Shelley's original and so on. But there was a movie. There was a Canadian production a few years ago, man, and it was called something like the Frankenstein Experiment or the Frankenstein Tapes or sort of Frankenstein Legacy. I don't know, but it was sort of a found footage film about these people who realized that one of their great great grandfathers was Victor Frankenstein, and he created the monster, and it's in Canada, it's in the Canadian wilderness, right? And the film makes the very inspired decision not ever to really show you the monster, but there's a scene where
huh.
the characters are out in this kind of like a meadow, and the monster is behind the trees, these trees. It's advancing towards them. The trees are shaking, and the thing is just howling. And at that moment, I was just like back to whatever age I was, 6, 7, something like that, just utterly terrified. And so that that's in a sense, like, that's kind of the beginning. I think when I was a freshman in high school, I read Stephen King, Christine specifically, but then I followed that up with Night Shift and Pet Cemetery. I mean, really anything I could get my hands on, The Shining,
Yeah.
Salem's Lot, and that was the sort of turning point. That was which to me, I remain, I remain fascinated by that. I remain fascinated by these moments where something happens and just boom, that's it. You're sort of set in a particular direction. So I'm still a big wimp when it comes to horror movies. I've tried. I have read a lot of horror fiction, and it's funny because most people I know say it's the opposite for them. Like, for me, the movie is completely out of my control, and that makes it really frightening. Whatever is going, because of course, until you see the monster, if you see the monster or the threat, whatever it might be, your mind is conjuring up all these crazy things.
Yeah.
And then when the monster finally does show up, it may be frightening, but you're, as Stephen King likes to say, you scream, but it's with terror, but also with relief, because you're like, I thought it was that thing that lives in my head. I thought it was a Frankenstein's monster that lives in my head. Oh, it's just an alien. And whereas most of my friends say, oh, I just look at it as like it's just a movie. It's different. Like it's just special effects. It's just whereas a book, most of my friends will say, that gets inside my head, that I have no control over. Whereas for me, I'm like, no, it's words on a page. It's fine. It's not, like, I can close the book.
Yeah, I'm on your side with that. I am the same way. I can read any and all horror fiction, and that's not to say that books don't creep me out. They often do, and I love that. But when it comes to so, like, with movies, I was gonna watch Longlegs the other day. My
Hmm.
fiance's on vacation right now, and I got like 15, 20 minutes in, and I was like, wow, I feel like such a bitch because I'm right now going to stop this movie and wait until my fiance's home because I'm getting creeped out in my house by myself watching
You just say, honey, I didn't want to have this experience without you. That's, I love it when we watch movies together.
when she called me yesterday, I mentioned, I was like, yeah, so I found this movie that I started watching, and I was saying, I will admit, I was saying it in a way that was kind of giving her the
Right,
push
right,
to
right.
be like, and I was like,
Come on,
and she
honey.
and she literally said, like, you got scared, didn't you? I was like, no, shut up, you got scared.
Right.
But yeah, no, so I'm totally, I agree with you there. Movies definitely, and I understand uh the point that with words on a page, it is, like you said, your mind creating the whatever horrible thing it is, entity, monster, alien, whatever. But with movies, I don't know, giving it that I guess already predetermined physical form just works on me for whatever reason. And it, like you said, I don't think I ever really realized it, but like you said, it's out of my control. Like, I
Yeah.
can't control what that thing looks like anymore. It is as terrifying as it is. And
Yeah, and
yeah,
and I also think for me, I mean, I was growing up and getting my sort of first real or prolonged horror exposure in the 80s. So there wasn't streaming. And so what that meant was that horror movies, let's say, you either had to go to the movies to see them, which was there was no way I was going to do that. Um, and and you could, I mean, we got, I'm trying to think when we got a VCR. We must have gotten a VCR about the mid 80s, like 84, 85, something like that. But there was no way my parents were ever going to let me rent like an R-rated horror movie. That was
yeah,
out the window. And those things weren't shown on network TV by and large. So horror movies, the horror movies I could watch were older ones that were on the local stations, usually on the weekend when they were trying to fill up time.
mm-hmm.
I didn't watch really those either. Like I found those equally frightening. But at the same time, in the 80s, of course, you have this horror boom. You have Stephen King and Peter Straub and Charlie Grant and Anne Rice and all these different people who are just producing this tidal wave of books. And I could read those. My parents didn't really care about those. Their biggest concern with Stephen King was that they thought he used a lot of bad language. That was what they'd heard, and they were afraid of. They didn't want me to be exposed to that. And I was like, you guys don't know the half of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's forever the dilemma. It's like, oh, just wanton violence is okay, but no sex.
Oh,
And yeah, like
absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah.
terror is fine, but no cuss words.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it was. Yeah. Well, I've had this same. I mean, for decades, I feel like I've had the same reflection. That oh my God, yeah, it's okay. All extreme violence is all right, but oh, don't show me a boob. That's just
exactly.
that's.
Yeah. Yeah. I luckily I come from a family that is pretty on the level with all that stuff. If
Yeah.
they didn't want to expose me to anything, and they kind of realized, because it was both my mom and dad separately told me. They were like, well, I mean, why would I be okay with you watching Boogie Nights if I'm not okay with you watching Saw, for random
Right.
example.
Right. Right.
And I was like, okay, I get it. I wasn't happy about it because I wanted to go rent. I did, like, that one was actually accurate. It was, I want to say 2001, 2002, so I was like 11, 12 years old, and I wanted to rent Boogie Nights. I don't remember why.
Because it
I
was
don't remember.
forbidden. It was like, this is a movie
Probably
about the
that's
porn industry,
Yeah, I think that was
like.
probably why. And yeah, but no, to their credit, they held firm on that.
Well, and they were,
It
at least in your case, they were not hypocritical, right? They were
yeah,
consistent. And I think
yes,
when you're a kid, um, you can deal with consistency better than inconsistency. Inconsistency, especially when you become an adolescent, inconsistency really bugs you. It's
yeah,
the H word, hypocrite, becomes incredibly powerful when you're a teenager, before you realize we're all just hypocrites, and you're like, whatever.
yeah. That's definitely true. Yeah. And then to go back to something you said earlier about watching that, or I guess having that idea of a Frankenstein movie in your head that you haven't been able to find. Just total aside here, there is a scene from a movie that I am 100% positive I saw when I was a kid, and I think it was the movie Broken Arrow, or well,
Hmm.
in my head, it's the movie Broken Arrow with John Travolta and Christian Slater,
Yep.
and in it, there's a scene where there's a big like fan that is like the size of the wall, and it's going, and someone gets pushed into it, like
Okay.
a criminal gets pushed into it, and I
Right.
remember that scene terrifying me as a kid. I had nightmares about it, and
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
never been able to find it. I've asked on Reddit, I've asked on every possible social media, and it just drives me crazy. So I can, if your Frankenstein dilemma here is driving you crazy, I can relate.
Well, I'll tell you what's even crazier was in the 90s, I guess. It might have been, I read Peter Straub's novel The Throat, which I think is maybe like his single greatest novel in some ways. I don't know if it's my favorite, but anyway. And I remembered quite vividly this chapter in The Throat, which detailed this one character who's trying to find another character, and he's taking this trip up into the highlands of Vietnam and all this kind of stuff. And I absolutely remembered that. And when I reread the book, it wasn't there. And I was and I recently listened to the audio version of the book, and it's still not there. And like listening to it this time, I was like, oh, okay, there's a couple of scenes that I think I sort of conflated, but nonetheless, I was sure there was an entire just chapter of that book, a big 50-page chunk of it that is just not in the book. Yet somehow in my memory I placed that, or expanded those little bits into this great big chunk of the book. Maybe that says, or says something about me, about the impact that those little details had on me, that they assumed this tremendous importance. But yeah, it's freaky, isn't it? It's one of those Bernstein Bear things.
Yeah, yeah. The what was it? The like Mandela effect.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah. The human brain is a wild thing, and but yeah, like there's a few things I have like that, similarly, that going back, but I won't get into all that right now. So a lot of your work, not all of it, but a lot of your work has a very distinct cosmic slash Lovecraftian slash weird with a capital W fiction kind of bent to it.
Hmm.
And what is it about that, or I guess it depends how you define those. Some people three different ways, some people all the same, but whatever it
Right.
is, what is it about that range of horror, that kind of corner of the genre that draws you in as opposed to say like splatterpunk or psychological thriller, which I mean, I know you
Sure.
read a whole bunch of different genres, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I absolutely lean. I'd say monsters. I always sort of lean towards monsters, the supernatural, the supernormal. Um, and uh, one answer to that question, I guess, would be that when I was a kid and I was reading, it was more reading King and then Clive Barker. Those guys would include these little throwaway lines and references, especially when King, before King really started to focus on completing the Dark Tower books, when that was something that would occasionally pop up, cause a wheel or something like that, and you would just be like, "What does that mean? Where did that come from?" And
Yes.
and Barker would do the same thing, right, with in the Hellbound Heart, with the Cenobites and so on, and so what I loved about these books was the impression that they gave that there was like this vast kind of universe out there beyond the books themselves, that the books were just taking place against this massive backdrop. And I love that sense. I love that sense, which I didn't really read Lovecraft um, in any kind of serious way until I was in my early 20s. I did read The Dream Quest of Unknown Cadith when I was like 14 or 15 because Stephen King recommended Lovecraft, and that was the only book I could find. And I read it, and I was just like, "What the hell is this? This is not,
That
this is
is a
not a
weird
horror
place to
novel."
start.
Yeah, and so it wasn't. So I kind of, in some ways, I feel like I missed out on that kind of primal impact that Lovecraft, can have on people. I think, I read in comparison or contrast, I read a lot of Robert E. Howard when I was oh man, middle school basically, and the Conan stories, but then also a collection of stories which I might have read that in my teens, called Wolf's Head and Other Tales, which had all these kind of like horror or horror adjacent stories in it, and I think at his best, Howard would evoke something similar. The difference is, I guess, that the nameless monster shows up, but Conan takes it out or whatever. That it's
Yeah.
there's a way to defeat whatever the thing is. But those guys really gave just to pick three, and then yeah, sure, later Lovecraft and Thomas Ligotti say gave this sense of this enormous context, and I just loved that. I just loved the thought of these kind of vast, shadowy realities that were moving around just outside of view, just briefly maybe coming into view. So yeah, I think that if and when I can evoke that in my fiction, I'm really happy to do that. I really love the thought of giving the reader a glimpse of something larger than the story, and that informs the story, and that afterwards, I hope kind of bounces around inside the reader's brain in some way. Um, I it's funny because I never really thought of myself as, like I say, a cosmic horror writer. I just thought I'm writing about monsters, and yet absolutely, when people say to me, "Oh, but this story or this story, cosmic horror," I have to say, "Yeah, you're right. It's yeah, you're absolutely right." So same thing with weird fiction. I think in recent years I've become a bit more interested in kind of some of the effects of weird fiction, because I've been reading a lot more of people like Robert Aikman, or paying a lot more attention to a writer like Brian Evanson, say, these people who are, or Stephen Rasnick Tem, these writers who are kind of deliberately elliptical and opaque, and I'm really fascinated by that. So some of the stuff that I've been writing has played around with that. But then I wrote a story a few years ago for a tribute anthology to Matthew Bartlett, who's a fantastic, weird horror writer, you know?
Oh yeah, we love
And
Matt around here.
yeah, and I kept up with it until I threw a kaiju in. At the very end, there's a giant monster in Leeds. So, there are times I feel like, which, I mean, you could argue that kaiju are a kind of cosmic menace and blah, blah, blah. But to me, it's just like it's a big monster, And
Yeah.
so, so uh, the writers I think of as much more weird than I am. Among my contemporaries, someone like Michael Sisko Bartlett, obviously, like I think that those are the people who are working like mining the heart of the weird or something like that. I see myself as every now and again I kind of traipse in and I'm like, hey guys, what's going on? And I do something and then I traipse back out again.
Yeah, I feel the same way about my own stuff. I've been trying to. I found it hard to commit totally to writing what I guess because weird fiction as a term I feel has a very broad definition that can mean a lot
Mm-hmm.
of different things to a lot of different people. We talked
Yeah.
about that a while back, and going by my definition, I've found it hard kind of to break the I guess the writing habits that I already have instilled in me that I've been writing with for the last 7, 8 years, however long it's been, and to kind of let go and not feel the need to, I guess, wrap up every loose end. People
Mm-hmm.
who have read my book are going to be like, "You didn't wrap up any loose ends in that. You don't have a problem with it." But, like, that's not what I mean.
Right. That's different.
um, yeah. But yeah, no, it's I like kind of like you said, just traipsing into these different subgenres and messing around in them. And yeah, it's fun. And I have noticed it in your stuff. I noticed it in Corpsemouth, in certain spaces in that
Oh yeah,
really kind of
absolutely.
evoke that eerie feeling that only stories that I don't want to say only weird fiction is or like a feeling that I only get from when I'm reading weird fiction in a way.
Well, I think that's the I think, because I agree that like weird fiction is this kind of capacious term, and I feel like it was adopted. It was initially I saw it as another attempt to evade the label of horror. It's not horror; it's weird fiction,
Yeah.
which kind of irritated me because I'm like, and I get it. I totally get what you could call the branding problem. I totally get that when you say to your friends and family, yeah, I write horror stories. A lot of times, you see the shutters come down over their eyes and they're just like, oh, well, whatever. And
Yep.
trying to figure a way around that is tricky. So I understand the desire to grab something like weird, which maybe doesn't work quite as well as people thought it did, but then I can see it developing into ironically like a kind of subset that's trying to identify what particular writers do in particular situations, and I think that there are writers whose work is deliberately deeply strange. I mean, what's his name? Aikman described his stories as strange stories, and I
Mm-hmm.
think the idea was just these are not quite like anything else. They're trying to be their own thing, and that doesn't mean that you can't identify certain common threads in them that you can't read, say, well, okay, Aikman tends to do these things, or Michael Sisko tends to do these things, or
Mm-hmm.
Bartlett really likes leeches. But but there's the thing, right? Like, so you look at Bartlett and you look at Aikman, and Bartlett is just quite willing to go all in. He'll hit you with flying leeches, right? And
Yeah.
there will just be. I mean, his short novel, The Obsecration, is some kind of small masterpiece, because it fits the events and the material of an 80s style blockbuster novel, 800-page doorstopper into about 150 pages. And
Mm-hmm.
to a certain extent, he does that by stripping out all the slice of life stuff. And he's like, nope, we're all going to the diner from hell. And he just piles it on and piles it on and piles it on. And it becomes this exercise, I think, in the Baroque, and just sort of seeing how far can you push things. And I guess you could maybe make the argument that like Aikman in his weird way does that too. Aikman is kind of like, how much can I not tell you but still freak you out, or still make you feel something? So in both cases, you could argue that the weird writers, that maybe authentically weird writers, or however you want to put that, take take certain methodologies, I guess, and certain narrative practices, and just run with them. They just push them, to see how far they can go with them.
Yeah, that's that's a good way of describing the ob ob obsecration.
Obsecration, the
Obsecration.
obsecration. Go
Yeah.
out and buy it now, people.
Seriously, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
And
no, it's
I remember describing it when I first read it to my fiance. I was like, this is somehow at the same time the most dense book I think I've ever read, but also the most like unfocused. Like, and I didn't mean that in a bad way. Like, it was just like you said, there was just so much going on at
yeah.
one
Well,
time,
he's
and I'm
like the
like, holy
guy
crap.
who's spinning all the plates at the same time, and you
Yeah,
just and he's like, now we're going to crash this plate into this plate, and a little bit of it is going to hop over onto this plate, and yeah, he's the thing about Matt Bartlett is, as much, if not more so than anybody else writing today, he's pursuing his own vision. He has his own take on things, and
yes,
he's just trying to see where he just trying to see he is seeing where he can go with that, where that leads him. And sometimes it's really funny, and sometimes it's utterly horrifying, and you can see, I think, connections. There is a kind of a Legati element to what he's doing. I think that's fair enough to say. I think he also, you can see some elements of Laird Barron's stuff in what he's
oh
doing,
yeah,
especially when Laird is at his most elliptical. But he's just, Bartlett is so much his own thing. I feel um, he's the this kind of writer where you think, in a better world, he would have a massive, like, the collected works of Matthew Bartlett, like if some major
yeah.
publisher or something like that. I I kind of feel like he's the kind of writer who's going to get picked up, like the French or the Spanish or the Italian. Something like that's going, oh, Matthew Bartlett. They're going to discover him, and it's going to be like he's going to be like this legend in places like that. The same thing that happened to Lovecraft and Defoe, where they were picked up by
Yeah.
the French, and the French were like, this is really good, and the Americans were like, oh well, if the French think so.
The blood man, Matt
Right.
Bartlett.
Bartlett, he likes your flying leeches. He's okay.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, no, Matt is awesome. I just got his WXXT, the second of the omnibuses. I don't know if he's put out more than that,
I
but it's the
I
second
think there's
I've
only,
gotten.
as far as I know, there's only two, because yeah, I have both of
Okay.
them as well, and I saw him at
Yeah.
Necronomicon, and he said that I think he's gonna try to stop with the third, but then he was like, but maybe I won't, or some that may just be my
Yeah.
wishful thinking.
Yeah, right. Like I love the stuff he does with the chat books. I haven't really gotten into chat books as like a because he actually like he's given me so much advice on writing over these last few years, and thank you, Matt. If you happen to see this, you're the best, dude. Um, but chat books are something I've always wanted to try, and I just have not been able to get into them just because my own writing ADD or whatever. But the stuff he does with the omnibuses and those chat books are so cool. There's those little slices of this world that he's building piece by piece is fascinating stuff.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of the, it was certainly in the past 10 years. It's been one of the most, kind of interesting fictional projects to watch going on.
Yeah, and I was it was so cool when I saw that he was getting the tribute anthology.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was I
yeah.
was like, oh, it's so cool. That and I think Laird Barron got one as well. Children
He
of Old
did. Yeah,
Leash.
yeah. He got one.
Yeah,
Geez. 10 years ago, something like that.
Oh, is that that long ago?
Yeah,
I
it
only
was it
read it
was a while
recently.
ago.
Oh
Yeah,
wow, that's crazy.
it's in in a similar way, it's an index to the effect that Laird's writing has had on people.
Yeah.
They were able to fill that tribute anthology very quickly, and
Oh, I'm
I
sure.
think
Yeah.
they had to turn some people away. That I feel that's a reasonable thing to say.
Oh yeah, for sure. He's one of the foremost horror authors writing today. I always feel weird calling someone a horror author because I feel like it separates them from kind of getting at what you were saying before. Like, I write horror and the
Right,
shutter's
right,
come
right.
down. Yeah,
Yeah,
but you know what I mean.
yeah, because he writes horror. He is a writer who writes horror. It becomes awkward. Just easier to
Yeah,
say horror
exactly.
writer or horror author,
Yeah,
whatever, and just let it go. We know it's not a pejorative term.
right. Yeah, for sure. So way back at the beginning of this, you just made a quick comment that you taught Frankenstein and
Yes, yes, I
or
did.
Mary Shelley, and that actually leads me into my favorite story of yours ever, Technicolor.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that was like a profoundly influential story, like for me as a writer, and just I love it as a fan. But I guess I'm just curious how that story came about. Were you talking about Poe one day in your class and was like, this is actually could be a story? I'm just kind of curious about the background behind that story.
Well, I think I say this in the story notes, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but in some ways it goes all the way back to my freshman year of college, where we read a selection of Poe's stories in one of my classes. We read The Mask of the Red Death, and the professor said, "Okay, your homework tonight is to go home and to look at The Mask of the Red Death and to look at the description of the Abbey, of Prince Prospero's Abbey, which has a succession of rooms running east to west, each one of which is a different color. And I want you to figure out what's the significance of those colors. What do they represent?" So of course, the next morning or whatever it was, Monday, Wednesday, something like that. Anyway, the next class we came in and we all had our elaborate explanations. This represents the times of the day. This represents the stages of your life, states of being, whatever, that sort of thing. And the professor, he wrote everything up on the chalkboard. This is when we still had chalkboards. And at the end of it, we see there's just this huge list, and you can see some crossover, but there's also some things that are very, very distinct. And we said to him, "So what does it mean? What's the right answer?" And he looked at us and he said, "I don't know." And that it was in some ways a very bold and very humble thing to say. It of course, at that particular age, you're thinking to yourself, "No, man, just give me the answer. Just give me the
Yeah.
answer, and no one gets hurt." So that stuck with me. And geez, when Ellen Datlow was putting together her Poe anthology, she reached out to me and she said, I think it was actually at a reader con that we were having a conversation, and she said, "Okay, I'm doing this anthology, and I want you to send me something for it, and you have to pick a story, so that there's no overlap, and." Right away, I picked The Mask of the Red Death, even though there were other stories I thought it would be fun to mess around with. I was like, no, it's like almost instinctively, I was like, that's got to be the one. And I've always been able to kind of, well, maybe not always, but for a long time, I've been able to write in this sort of faux academic style, this kind of analytical teacher professor kind of voice. And so that was really what started it. Was just, I'll tell you what these colors really mean. I'm gonna give you the answer that professor would never give me. But I guess you could say the answer is always death. You always, in a sense, you always come to death at the end of it. And yeah, I've just, for whatever weird reason, um, I find that I'm fascinated by and therefore able to make up like weird history, to invent these characters and so on. I kind of feel that a lot of the sort of supernatural apparatus in that story, if you will, derives from stuff I was doing in the I guess like sort of mid '90s to early 2000s when I was doing a lot of graduate work in English, and a lot of the literary theory I was studying was all about language, and it was all about the power of language and so on, and that I think played into the writing of Technicolor, and it was fun. When I think about Poe on the screen, I think about those Roger Corman adaptations, for better or for worse, and
Yeah.
all the gaudiness and the goriness of it. And Poe Poe was never one to turn aside from the gaudy or the gory, so I felt justified in that.
Yeah, for sure. That's like a the story is just creepy. First off, we'll just get that just get that out of the way. But so I had up to that point never read Mask of the Red Death, so it prompted me to go back and read Mask of the Red Death, and I had read a little bit of Poe here and there throughout my however many years of life up to that point, and so that story kind of inspired me to go back, and I've read all the Poe I can get my hands on since then.
Yeah.
And another way that it really had an effect on me was I when I read that story, like I was aware that you could kind of do non-traditional, I guess, presentation
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
stories and still tell stories, but just not in a uh he did this, he said, that kind of
Right. 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 Right.
traditional prose, and that kind of actually not, and even not even just Technicolor, but a lot of your work and others too. But really kind of opened me up to the idea of non-traditional writing styles, I suppose, and like I've found a particular affinity for the epistolary style, like
Mm-hmm.
journal entries and book entries, and but anyways, Technicolor is a story where I was just kind of discovering that, and that really had a huge effect on me. And I just there wasn't much of a more of a can't talk. There wasn't much more of a point to this than for me to say I love that story.
Oh
That
well,
was a roundabout way.
that's I'm happy. However long it takes you to say that, that's totally fine. Yeah, I mean, at that point when I came back to writing horror, um, in the very late '90s, one of the ideas I had was to take, kind of like revisit traditional monsters, and traditional texts in horror, film and fiction, but to take those and then to bring those together with different kinds of like literary techniques. And so to write, I wrote a story in the form of a play, a zombie story in the form of a play, because
Hmm.
why not, um, and I'm still trying to do that kind of stuff. I'm still trying to, I think more of my stories now, they may experiment more with, that kind of, Aikman leaving things out, but every now and again I just like to think, well, what if you told the story this way? What if you told the story from this point of view? Or and there are sort of longer projects that I'm still slowly working my way towards, that continue that, because I just, in a way, I just think it's cool. I just think I feel like there's, something really interesting about taking this, the traditional monster and all of the baggage that goes along with it, and then smashing that together with some kind of different form of narration. Sometimes, as you said, the epistolary form is very old, but it's not a way that we write stories a lot anymore. So to
Hmm.
to bring those things together, a few years ago, I wrote a story for, Ellen Datlow's anthology Final Cuts, and it's a film collection, film anthology, excuse me, and, it's a vampire story, but it's an epistolary vampire story told through emails and told through, online articles and such. And I thought to myself, on the one hand, like, I was like, yeah, that's being very true to the spirit of the vampire, even as I was trying to do some different things with the vampire.
Yeah. Final Cuts was such a cool anthology. All of Ellen's stuff is amazing, but I Final Cuts I love that one.
Yeah, that one I feel
Um,
really got hit by COVID. It was really a sort of COVID casualty,
yeah,
there wasn't. Ellen usually promotes these things pretty heavily with readings and that sort of, and it just, all of that was just shut down. But no, I agree.
yeah,
I think that's one of her finest anthologies.
yeah. Same, like the lineup, as always. Not to say other ones aren't, but the lineup in that one is just unbelievable. I
Yeah.
mean the amount of, and she gets all these people with good reason, yourself included. Um, but sorry, I jump around on this a
No,
lot.
no, totally fine. That's totally fine.
You mentioned earlier Legati,
Mm-hmm.
and I like to talk Legati a lot
Okay.
because the guy fascinates me,
Sure.
and his stuff fascinates me. So what I how do I want to put this? I guess when did you discover Legati, and what was it about his stuff that drew you in? Because I've asked this question to probably 10 different people and gotten 10 different answers.
I feel like I had heard Legati's name in the '90s, but it was all small press stuff, and again, that was a time when I was living in the Mid Hudson Valley, and I actually no, it would have been even a little bit earlier than that. It must have been in the '80s. Um, and it would have been okay. So thinking about it, it would have been Primeval. It would have been Doug Winter's big anthology that Legati had a story in, and that was the first time that I read Legati, and I thought, oh, this guy's pretty cool. And then I don't think I saw anything until I lived in Albany, New York, for a couple of years, and in one of the local bookstores, there was the Carolyn Graff edition of Songs of a Dead Dreamer, and with an introduction by Ramsey Campbell, and I was like, oh my God, this is Thomas Leggett. I got to get this. So I got it, and I read it. Some of it worked for me. Some of it I just found kind of confusing,
Yeah,
because it was so different from King, or Straub or Barker or Joe Lansdale. It was so much its own thing, and so something like The Last Feast of Harlequin, which is a much more sort of traditional kind of story,
yeah.
that I was like, oh, okay, good. But then there were other things that just I kind of bounced off. And I had the sense, um, with Legati, because I feel like around that same time, maybe, Weird Tales, I think they were in, like, they moved to a digest sized format, and their kind of approach was that every issue had a focus on a different writer, and it had some of that writer's fiction, and also an extensive interview with that writer. And so the Legati issue and interview was really, really interesting, and I think that the interview helped as much as anything for me
Mm-hmm.
to understand, I guess, a little bit better what was going on in the stories. And later on, um, Grimscribe, I think I think I know the exact, like, local Barnes and Noble, because I'd moved back to the Hudson Valley by then. That I picked that up in, and that one I went through, and that one had more of an impact on me, I think. But I think, Legati, it was weird, because Legati, almost like Lovecraft, like the more I've read Lovecraft over the last 30 years, say 30 plus years, the more I've kind of felt like, oh yeah, this is cool, and look what he does here. And initially, when I was reading Lovecraft, I was reading him almost kind of academically, and now and there's still a bit of that in my reading of him, but I'm also, there were certain things I really like, certain stories I really like. And I almost feel the same way that I was doing the same thing with Legati, was reading Legati really kind of academically, because at that
Mm-hmm.
point in time, so much of my focus on, in my life, was academic, was pursuing graduate studies in English and so on. And so I think I brought a lot of that to Legati, and I saw a lot of what Legati was doing through that kind of lens of, deconstruction, and again, an attention to language and the kinds of things that language does. A few years ago now, and I'm trying to, this might have been pre-COVID. It was when the Penguin edition of Legati's first two collections was published, I went
Yeah.
to an event. I was part of an event where God, Tobias Carroll, I think it is, who's a fine writer and critic, read one of Ligatti's stories, maybe two, and he certainly read one, and it was hysterical. I had never realized how funny Ligatti could be, and that kind of fascinated me. That made me think, man, there's still more to this guy than I realize. I always mean to sort of do a deep dive into Legati, to just sort of submerge myself in his stuff. And I've sometimes wondered if listening to the audio versions, how what kind of effect that would have. Because as I said, I think this is true of many writers, that there were things that come out when you listen to the stories that are not necessarily self-evident to, in part because of the lenses I'm wearing. Because like when I was reading Legati, I was thinking, here's the heir to Lovecraft and all this kind of stuff, right? And then you read him and you're like, yes and no,
Yeah.
it's um so I think that like Legatti's kind of ongoing concerns, obsessions, projects, however you want to put them, they fascinate me in part because they've been such an influence on people like Bartlett. Like there were so many writers. Um, Billy Martin, who publishes under Poppy Z. Bright, wrote the introduction to the Nightmare Factory, the big
Yep.
anthology of Legatti's work, talking about his importance. So I think that there are ways in which Legatti and Legatti's work has probably disseminated in ways that I'm not even fully aware of.
Yeah. He's the So the reason I ask that, and the reason I ask everybody who is familiar with Legatti's work that, is because there's a story he wrote that it's not one of his more well-known ones. Apparently, I didn't know this. The first story I ever read by him is called "The Small People,"
Okay,
and that story just gave me a feeling that no other story from any other author ever has given me, and
sure.
I am on a quest to figure out why that story did that, gave me that feeling in that,
Hmm.
that way. So that was just, I'm adding, that was another piece to that puzzle that I was adding there. I'm trying to just compile everyone's answers to see if I
Sure.
can decode this story.
Yeah, it's
um
it's sometimes. I mean, yeah, I mean, I felt that way with a lot of Peter Straub stuff when I was a kid and I first read Ghost Story and then Shadowland. I was kind of like obsessed with those novels. I would return to them over and over again because I knew, like, I understood enough to know that I really liked them and I really thought they were cool. But at the same time, when I got to the end, I was like, but man, I know I'm not getting everything. I know I'm missing
mhm.
things, and that did not upset me. That was like, oh man, that means I get to go back and reread it. So I think sometimes it is a kind of process, where you kind of read it and then you let it percolate in your thoughts for a while, and then you go back and you reread it and you'll notice new things. I mean, our second time through anything, right, we always see things we never saw before because now we know the
Yes.
story, now we know how it ends, and eventually um, we come to more of an idea of what's going on. I re-listened again, did the audiobook of Ghost Story last year, and there were new things. There were things I hadn't recognized before. Same thing when I did The Throat. I was just like, oh my god, there's all this crazy stuff in here that even during my last reread I never noticed. So
Yeah. Yeah, just different things, little things you pick up on that you don't when actually reading it. I can definitely relate to that. I for when I was a kid, I read every day. I would get home from school and I would sit in my room and I'd read books. Like that was just what I enjoyed doing. But as I grew up and got other hobbies, reading fell to the wayside, whatever. Years later, I picked it up again, and I have so much trouble reading now. Like in terms of actually retaining what I'm reading, and
mhm.
it has made me such a slow reader that like I find myself getting frustrated because just the way my brain is now, I'll read a full page, get to the end of it, and realize that I've been analyzing a sentence on the second line of the page, and I haven't been paying any attention at all to what I've been reading since then. So
Yeah.
audiobooks have been a huge help with that, and I really like having someone kind of, someone else read it to you essentially is, I don't know, for me anyway, I'm able to get into those little nooks and crannies and extrapolate those things I would never have gotten actually like physically reading the book myself. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I get that. Yeah. But back to you, John. Sorry, we went on a long
No, no,
tangent
no.
there.
I,
My
I
bad.
think, I know. I look, not that I'm not happy to talk about myself, I'm an egotist, right? But there are so many writers, Bartlett, Ligotti, for example, right? That deserve to be talked about. And,
Yeah.
and I think that, we, I feel like there's, I don't know. I just feel like I want to do that. I just feel like I want to kind of pay it around, like pay it
Yeah.
forward, pay it back, whatever. But these are the people that I'm reading, um, and in Bartlett's case, we've hung out a bit together,
Mhm.
and I want to be able to kind of pay tribute to their work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's this one guy, Nick Boddick. I hear he's doing pretty great these days.
I
He's
don't
got
want
a
to talk
lot of
about
great.
Boddick. I don't want to
I
talk
know.
about Boddick. I cannot forgive him. I'm
Fair.
just going
That's
to leave it
fair.
at that. I'm just going to leave
Yeah,
it at
no, he
that.
does. He
Okay.
does suck. He's an idiot. He
I,
sucks.
I, I'm
Uh,
not going to say anything more. I'm just saying that yeah, yeah, that restaurant will never open again. Is just all I'm saying. Yeah.
uh, yeah, it's we. I have been kicked out of restaurants before. Different life, but um,
I'm not taking the
so
bait. I'm not taking the bait. Nope. I'm not going to talk about that. But suffice to say, it nearly bankrupted Kentucky Fried Chicken. So
I like this bit, and I want to try to get this going on this show, just to be a recurring thing that just like tiptoes around these heinous things I've done, these atrocities I've committed
yeah,
in
you can't
places.
even tiptoe around them. You have to keep like a cordon sanitaire. You have to make sure that you're really really far away from them because, my God, yeah.
Oh man, I set myself up for that. So I wanted to ask you, just kind of, wow, yeah, we are almost to an hour actually. Anyways,
That's okay. We have I have time.
okay. So, do you, not do you, I guess, what is your, I wanted to ask you about your writing career, but in a more specific way. Do you recall the first story you ever wrote, the first story that ever really gained a lot of traction with readers, and then what is your favorite story of yours?
Yeah, the first story I wrote, I was I think in kindergarten. No, actually, no, first grade. We were allowed to write a story, or I shouldn't say we were told to write a story, but we were allowed to illustrate it, and that was really exciting to me because I loved to draw when I was a kid. And until I hit high school, I thought I was going to be a comic book artist. That was really my goal. But I went to Catholic high school, no art program, and also discovered Christine at the same time. So things took a different turn. But so yeah, I wrote this story about King Kong versus Godzilla because all the kids in my class were talking about that. And the thing was, I didn't really know what Godzilla looked like. I had seen a picture. It was probably from Son of Kong, where Kong Jr. is facing this four-legged animal, a four-legged dinosaur, and I thought, well, Godzilla must look like that. So, so yeah, I wrote this story about from King Kong's point of view. I was King Kong. I was walking through the woods. I saw Godzilla. He breathed fire on me and set my chest hair on fire, and I picked up a lake and drowned him. And even at the time, right? Um, I say this, even whatever age that would have been, like 6, I was like, that doesn't really work. You can't really pick up a lake, but
That's where
um,
that's where I got caught up too. I was like, I wonder how the
yeah, how would
physics
that
work
work?
there.
Yeah, exactly. He should have picked up Godzilla and thrown him in the lake. But um, so and yeah, I remember drawing the picture, and I was really happy that I got to draw the picture. When it's funny when I was fifth or sixth grade, um, when everybody's obsession was the Lord of the Rings, was the Ralph Bakshi rotoscoped Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. Um, I we had a Halloween writing activity in our class, and we just had to write a Halloween scary Halloween story. Um, and I wrote a story about a kid who goes out to the, it's like a barn behind his house, and he sees a Nazgul there. Although I didn't call it a Nazgul.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I may have even seen the Rankin Bass animated Return of the King with the king of the Nazgul with his glowing eyes, because that was what I described. There's this shadowy figure, and 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 I was the I think I far and away wrote the longest story in the class. Most people wrote like a page. And I remember the teacher like drawing the blinds and turning down the lights. Now, whether this actually happened or not, but in my mind, and I started to read the story, and there came this moment where I could feel I had everybody's attention. I could feel, I had them all in the palm of my hand. That there's this particular kind of energy that you become aware of. This focus of everybody on you, and that I think carried with me. I didn't realize it at first, but that carried with me. Um, in terms of my favorite among my own stories, I mean, it tends to be the one I'm working on at the moment. That's I or the one I'm most anxious about at the moment. So when I wrote Mr. Gaunt, there was a long time where I was really anxious about that story. I was really anxious that I had peaked with that story, and that was as good as I was ever going to get. Um,
I
and
hate that feeling.
Yeah, it's just I think it's because if you have any success, and if people say to you, Nick, I really love that story about the Kentucky Fried Chicken incident, then like the more people say that to you, the more you're pleased. But the I feel like the writer brain, is prone to self sabotage, and so the writer brain is like, yeah, so I guess that was, you probably pack it in. That was probably about as good as it got for you. And I think that
Yeah.
you just have to you have to ignore that, because I don't know that you can necessarily fight it. I think that you have to ignore it, do your work, and let the additional work that you do kind of build up. And what happens is at a certain point you're like, well, that was still a good story, but there have been some other good stories too. People told me. So I think that that's I don't know, that's the way that you kind of get around that. If at least short term, I don't know. I don't ever want to feel that I've like peaked as a writer. Like I don't ever. Um, I will say that the last story in Corpsemouth, Keened, which is about my mom, I have a sort of sentimental attachment to, but that's just a sentimental attachment.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know how I've made it an hour into this interview without mentioning this so far, but The Fisherman. I that is one of my all-time favorite books, and I
Thank you.
wanted to talk to you about that. Um, so that seems, to me as a reader, that reads like it was at least in part somewhat inspired by, I guess, real life circumstances. Um, and I could be totally off base on that. I don't know. But I'm just curious as to how The Fisherman came together. Did you set out to start writing a novel, and then that's what we ended up with, or did you uh was it something that evolved from a shorter story, and then on the other
Yeah, no,
side of that?
it was definitely, it evolved from a shorter story.
Okay.
At that time in my life, I was really anxious about being able to keep writing stories. Like I would read interviews with writers, and they would say, I my brain is this unending well of stories, and I'll the rest of my life I'll never get to the bottom of it. And I would think I would feel really jealous and a little intimidated too, because I didn't feel that same way. I didn't feel like my head was brimming with ideas. So I had this idea that I would write one story a year and try to publish one story a year. And if I could do that, I figured that was manageable, and I could come up with one idea per year. That seemed doable to me. But to make things even easier on myself, I was like, okay, I'm going to go through those traditional monsters, and I did the mummy, and I did the skeleton, and so on. And I'm going to keep doing that. And so I was trying to find as many ways as possible, as many ways, I don't know, vines I could swing through the forest on or something like that, as many supports as I could find. And at this particular time, my wife had found out that she was pregnant with our son. And I kind of knew that just I wasn't going to get a lot of writing done in the near future. So I started to write this story thinking this is going to be the last one for a little while. And it started off in part as a kind of riff on Moby Dick. Um, and then it just grew and grew and grew. And I think probably by the time I'd started the middle section, the story within the story, I think I really kind of knew that was we were heading into novel territory, and I kind of freaked myself out and was like, I can't write a novel, I'm not ready. So I put it away and started another story, which turned out to be my first novel, House of Windows. So it was like there was just like my brain was just like, okay, we're writing a novel. And then over the next several years, I returned. I returned to the Fisherman again and again. Every now and again, I would just pull it out, and then there there came a point when Laird Barron, my good friend Laird, was coming to live with my wife and I. His life had kind of fallen apart on the West Coast, and he came over to stay with us for a while and kind of figure out his next steps. And I thought, man, Laird's coming. I better get this thing done. Like I'd been sort of working on it, and so in the couple of months before he got here, I just kind of knuckled down and finished the draft, and then sent it to my agent, and we shopped it around publishers who were like, "This is really great, but we're going to pass on it." In terms of in terms of like personal experience, I think my dad died when I was just before I turned 24, and we had this really really contentious relationship that was maybe starting to kind of iron itself out a bit before in the year or two before he died. And then he died, and he just left. It was just this catastrophe. None of us, none of myself or my siblings, my mom, none of us was prepared for it, and it really was like a kind of hammer blow to the family. And I yeah, I just had this tremendous grief inside me that I didn't know how to deal with. And um, I I don't know. I was very nervous about, like, say, going to therapy or something like that. Um, that's for people who are sick.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was all kind of waiting there, ready to come out when the novel asked for it.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it felt like because it's the way that and I'm trying to avoid getting into spoilers here because that is truly a book everyone should go into blind, in my opinion. It's but the way that it explores grief felt like such a like I everyone has their own form of has experienced some form of grief in one way or another, and like I don't know the way that you explored it, and I guess the lens through which you explored it was very relatable to me in such a way that it made me be like, okay, it seems like it's based on something real. Um, and then actually regarding the story within the story, that's something else I wanted to ask about. That was so jarring to me at first. The first time I
Sure.
tried reading the book, that I because again, it was one of these things that was outside the norm that I was not used to, and so I think you kind of just answered this, but it read to me at first like that was an entirely separate story that you then found a way to work in, but from what it sounds like, that was just a part of the writing process of the Fisherman.
Yeah,
Or
I mean, to be honest, I thought that I recognized pretty early on that the story was growing, and I thought, this is probably going to be a novella, and I thought that the story within the story would probably be like 20 or 30 pages. Like I thought it would be a significant chunk of the story, but I didn't think that it would be um, about the same length as the surrounding material combined. And
yeah.
I I kind of recognized. I mean, where I really left off for a good long time was in the middle of the book when Rayner and the other guys are going into the house that the fisherman is within. And I just sort of
Mhm.
stopped there, and I wasn't really sure what to do there. Like part of me thought, oh, I was going to have the point of view character, this young guy, Johann Schmidt. I thought I was going to have him injured, and things were going to like sort of, he's going to hear things in the distance, and then they would come back and be like, it's over. Um, but that didn't, and then I was like, that's not quite right. And so I had all these different, like, sort of these ideas that were kind of evasions in a way. Oh, maybe some monster's going to attack him, like some, fish creature is going to attack him, but it's only going to be one. And it was the great Jeff Ford whose advice I poached from Laird. When Laird was writing The Croning, his first novel, Ford had told him, you're going to feel the urge to play it safe. Fight that urge. Just go nuts. Knowing Ford, it was probably go fucking nuts. But and I just thought, okay, I'm going to do that. And so um, the book became a lot wilder. That the middle part of the book became a lot wilder as a result. And I think even at the end, when we're just back to Dan and Abe, it's still, though, the landscapes they go through became a lot wilder as a result of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it I kind of liked the idea, although I understand that it doesn't work for everybody. I liked the idea that there was this kind of backstory that really explained the significance of what was happening in the front. That like if you had this backstory and then you read the story in the front, you would be like, oh right, I understand what's going on here. Um,
Yeah.
but I also knew that it was asking the reader um, to trust me, and to give me trust that depending, they might not feel I had earned.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've always felt that that must have felt like a really big swing on your part because I'm sorry. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that and it's become clearer to me with the passage of time. Oh yeah, this is, this was asking a lot from the reader. And it it makes the rejections of the novel by the sort of, big five publishers, it makes them make a bit more sense, because
Hmm.
especially from a writer who, uh, was I would hardly claim I'm well known yet, but was even less less well known anyway. um it was a lot to ask, and I can imagine them being like, we just don't want to take this gamble.
Yeah, it's I had truly never read anything like it before. It was the first actually because it's whenever there's a question on Reddit posted like, oh, it's a modern Lovecraftian story that you love or whatever, and the Fisherman is always like number one. It's always every time, and it was the first longer, I guess, novel length Lovecraftian work I'd ever read, and it was. I just totally lost my train of thought right there. I'm so sorry.
Well, it's a weird, like it's you're like getting this. I can understand how somebody, I think, given the associations we have with Lovecraft and his work, comes to this thing, and it's like, okay, the first three chapters are, these two grieving widowers, and yeah, there's some kind of weird stuff, but and there's a lot of like fishing stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
then you just dive into this historical narrative about building a reservoir, and it's with, and I can understand how people would just be like, how is this Lovecraftian? In what way is this Lovecraftian? If I feel like if you persist, if you get to the end of the book, you're like, oh yeah, big monster, cosmic. Okay, yeah, I sort of understand, but I think um, I think that where I probably part ways with Lovecraft most, I think, is in the amount of time I'm willing to spend on character. But I think Lovecraft does
Yeah.
character more than he gets credit for. Um, and you could absolutely say, "Oh, here are these two white guys, going out to face them, in the form of Abe and Dan," and you could say, "Oh, that's kind of Lovecraftian, in an unintentional way." Um, but in the sort of the obsession with emotion, the obsession with grief that the book shows, I can understand that doesn't necessarily seem to graft onto Lovecraft particularly well.
Yeah, for sure. That was when I first read Lovecraft, the first thing I really like noticed from it as a in a literary sense was that yeah, there what or I guess I should say what I perceived at first was that yeah, there's really no character development. Like they are essentially the same more or less just a bit crazier by the end of the story as they were in the beginning. But you're right. I also have since come to feel that he doesn't get enough credit where in that area because there's quite a few of his stories that the characters do have shifts in their way of thinking. And it might not be some real super profound way that's going to change their personality forever, but they are learning from the things that the information they're taking in and the people they're talking to, and it is coloring their outlooks in a way, which I feel like that's what character development is.
Yeah, and
So,
I think that Lovecraft he shows a maybe a narrow focus, but a focus on relationships among men, friendships among men, quite often a kind of mentor mentee relationship between often an older man and a younger man. And often in his stories, or often enough, it becomes the duty of the older man to in some way avenge the younger man. And I
mm-hmm.
find so there, as I said, it's very narrow, but it is there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, John, I really appreciate you joining me today. Like I said, I've been wanting to have you on here since I started this way back when, and I'm so glad we were finally able to do it. If anybody wants to find you, find your work, where can they do so?
Oh my God, I'm all over the internet. It's disgusting. I spend far too much time on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky. I don't yet TikTok. I doubt I ever will. But having said that, who knows? Next week I'll be like, look, join me on TikTok, fam.
Doing
So,
like dances.
yeah, exactly. Doing weird dances, talking about the Kentucky Fried Chicken incident, and or not talking about it, as the case may be. So, so yeah, you can. And I have a blog which is called Mr. Gaunt. So if you look that up, you'll find me. I intermittently update it. I'm not really good at that either. So there you go.
All right, awesome, John. Thank you again so much, and I will definitely talk to you soon.
Yes, you will. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine. Take care.